Standing in the hallway, I found myself at a crossroads, equidistant between the back door and the entrance to the basement. It struck me just how serene the silence was, interrupted only momentarily by a faint, uncertain sound, perhaps the shuffle of feet or even a distant scream. A sudden, eerie sensation of cold and prickling discomfort enveloped my entire body. I blinked and drew in a deep breath, attempting to dispel the strange feeling that had washed over me. It was as if I had momentarily forgotten the purpose of my presence there. The familiar surroundings of the kitchen seemed subtly foreign, and I couldn't help but contemplate Hank's recurring words. Maybe Hank is right, I mused. I've spent too much time alone, and my mind is slowly unraveling. Now I am an elderly woman, having lived alone in the house my late husband painstakingly constructed for me over the past decade since his passing. My only son, Hank, resides in the neighboring town, a 2-hour drive away. He faithfully visits me once a week to lend a hand with chores and at times offer his well-intentioned lectures about my decision to retain the house, a decision that often leaves him exasperated. Despite my age, I do not view myself as fragile. Over the years, I have never been overly concerned about falling seriously ill or facing the prospect of death. Occasionally, I might catch a common cold, necessitating a few days of bed rest. Some nights, the aches in my feet after hours of meticulously tending to my garden remind me of my advancing age. During such times, Hank and his wife Sarah would come to stay with me until my health improved. These are the inevitable inconveniences of growing old, susceptibility to ailments and the gradual transformation into a burden on one's family. Hank has persistently urged me to rent out the house and move in with him and his wife, a proposition Sarah is more than amenable to, as he often assures me. She is a kind and caring woman who treats me as if I were her own mother. While Hank's personality bears a strong resemblance to his late father's, both possessing strong wills, sensitivity, persistence, and exceptional household skills, we share a striking physical resemblance. We both have thick black hair, and our pale skin, long straight noses, and piercing blue eyes make us look like mirror images. This very morning, as I struggled in the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Hank called once again, attempting to convince me to sell the house and move in with them. For what felt like the millionth time, I declined, instead extending an invitation for him and Sarah to join me for dinner next week. My own father had once imparted to me a piece of wisdom. When you must decline someone's request for assistance, make amends by inviting them to share a meal, a gesture that might alleviate their disappointment. I'm not sure if it's a quirk of small-town courtesy or merely a diversionary tactic. This time, my son was insistent. According to the news, people had once again started disappearing under mysterious circumstances. There was a deranged individual, disconnected from common sense, on a deadly rampage. Despite the gravity of the situation, I couldn't help but chuckle, trying to ease his concern. After all, who would harbor any desire to abduct an elderly lady like me? I certainly possessed no significant wealth. My laughter continued, much to his irritation. "Mom, please, for once in your life, hear me out. I love you and want to take care of you," he implored, but I interrupted with a teasing tone. "Now don't you get all sentimental with me, dear Popsicle, because I know you can be." I sighed, my frustration mounting. At times, dealing with his constant nagging could be quite exasperating. "Then consider selling the house, move in with me, and please never call me that again. If Sarah—" His voice trailed off. "Fine. Fine, what? I won't call you dear Popsicle ever again. No, I won't sell the house, Hank. Mom, please," he lowered his voice. "I'm not asking you to sell it, just rent it out. Use the money to pamper yourself or something. Don't be overly thrifty. Travel the world." "I happen to love being thrifty." "Well, that's your prerogative. There's a dangerous lunatic on the loose, kidnapping and harming people, according to the news," he continued. "I can't sleep at night imagining you alone in that old house." "You sound just like your father. Anyway, I can't chat for long. James will be here any minute. I've agreed to babysit his son today. They have an important lunch with a client in the city and will be away for a few days." "Who?" "James and Stephanie Ham, our new neighbors. They moved here a few months ago. I mentioned them in our last conversation." "Oh, you mean those incredibly noisy new neighbors. Haven't you had any rest since they arrived?" It almost makes you wish the Greens hadn't moved to Colorado, doesn't it? I don't know what you're talking about. They're outrageously loud, Mom. I heard their kid howling like a possessed puppy all night during our last stay. I couldn't get a wink of sleep. Sarah thought I was just dreaming. You can hear them? I'm not deaf. And by the way, Mom, I'm deadly serious about this situation. This person is unhinged. Who? James? I heard him audibly sigh in frustration on the other end. The deranged lunatic, he exclaimed. Mom, I'm genuinely worried about you. You've been zoning out quite often lately. Well, that's what comes with old age. Seriously, this individual is highly dangerous, as the news reports. Why would anyone want to harm an elderly, financially modest woman like me, Hank? Surely you don't believe they're out there targeting solitary old women just for the fun of it. What in the world, Mom? Watch your language. As I sat in my dim and damp kitchen that morning, my mind involuntarily drifted back in time 66 years ago. Much like Hank, I too had been an only child. My mother had abandoned us because she wasn't ready to give up her life for motherhood. Years later, in my late 20s, she had shown up unannounced at my door, attempting to mend a non-existent relationship. I had informed her that she had the wrong address and firmly slammed the door in her face. I wouldn't hear from her again until 2 decades later, when her husband called me to convey the news of her passing after a long battle with lung cancer. I chose not to attend her funeral. She had always been a stranger to me. In contrast, my father was a kind, affectionate man, though he could be strict when necessary. That particular morning over breakfast, he informed me that he was going on a work trip to New York for a few days and requested that I stay at the home of an old acquaintance until his return. I tried to convince him that I was perfectly capable of looking after myself, but he remained steadfast. I was to spend the entire week with the elderly Mrs. Gloch. There had been a series of perplexing disappearances in the area, and it deeply concerned my father. One of the missing was Peter Corns, a child from a wealthy family downtown, and it was believed to be connected to other mysterious vanishings, potentially orchestrated by the same culprit. My father was gravely worried. But I don't even know this Mrs. Gloff, I protested, pushing aside a bowl of my father's delectable homemade chicken soup and savoring its lingering flavor. You've met her before. She was at Jody Curry's 8th birthday party. That peculiar old lady? I gawked at him in disbelief. Natalie. He put down his spoon, looking exhausted and extremely frustrated. She's an old friend of your grandmother from the farm, and she's the only one willing to host you for a few weeks. Please understand. This trip is crucial. If it goes well, I might get a promotion, and you know how important this job is for us. He attempted to reason with me. I know, but remember what I told you last night? Yeah, Dad. I sighed and rolled my eyes. Don't talk to strangers. Don't go out after dark. Don't venture into the woods. Blah, blah, blah. Good. You're a smart kid. I've raised you well. Then let me stay here. I can cook for myself and take care of the house. It's a piece of cake. Besides, you'll only be gone for a few days. I can ask Sally to stay with me, I pleaded. He shook his head. Absolutely not. Sally isn't your babysitter. It's not like I'll be any safer staying with that elderly lady. Yes, you will. Besides, Mrs. Gloff's house is just a few blocks away from your school, and you're perfectly healthy. You can walk. What if she's some kind of witch or something even worse? I uttered, only to swiftly recognize the immaturity of my words. Very well. Perhaps she can impart some magical tricks or spells to help you mature and act your age, he responded sternly, rising from his chair and somewhat forcefully depositing his empty plate in the sink. Dad, please, I whined as a last-ditch effort to persuade him to let me stay home alone. He waved both hands dismissively, no longer willing to entertain my pleas, and departed from the kitchen. I slumped my shoulders in defeat, hanging my head low. The next morning I reluctantly exited my father's car when we came to a stop in front of Mrs. Gloff's house, situated on the outskirts of town. Her front yard appeared neglected, with tall grass and thick snake-like tendrils of overgrown bushes. The house itself had an ancient and weathered look, its light brown paint peeling from years of exposure to the elements, giving it an almost lifeless appearance. 2 massive willow trees loomed at the entrance, casting sprawling shadows that chilled the air. Come on, Nat. Hurry. Remember what I told you about being extra cautious and alert, he urged, glancing nervously over his shoulder as though he hadn't already given me an earful the night before and during our journey. His disheveled black hair fluttered in the brisk morning breeze. Yeah, I replied gloomily, dragging my feet along the tree-lined path leading to the front porch. Promise me you'll behave, okay? He reiterated. I will if she does. Nat, he sighed with exasperation. All right, fine, I will, I retorted. Didn't I tell you to wipe that miserable expression off your face? He rolled his eyes at me. How's that going for you? As well as your attempts to get rid of that silly mustache, Dad, I grumbled. The old wooden boards creaked and groaned as we ascended the front porch, as if announcing our arrival. My father knocked on the front door methodically, while I continued to survey the somber, hushed neighborhood, dreading the misery I anticipated over the next few days. I heard faint, light footsteps approaching behind the door, which gradually swung open, revealing the dim, lengthy corridor within. Mrs. Gloff's face emerged from the narrow gap, her large, eerie black eyes fixing on us. Instinctively, I zipped my jacket up to my neck until it wouldn't go any further. Good morning, Annie, my father greeted her cheerfully. Ah, David, good morning, she greeted in a low, gravelly voice that immediately conjured images of a frog. And this must be young Natalie. With a widened door, she turned her head, inspecting me from head to toe. An unpleasant odor hit my nostrils, prompting me to take a cautious step backward as unease settled in my stomach. She was an exceptionally tall and emaciated woman in her late 70s, her face etched with deep lines from years of strenuous farm work. Close up, she appeared even more unsettling than I had remembered. Her long, crooked nose almost brushed against mine as she bent down for a closer look. Wrinkles adorned her face like the creases of an old, well-worn rag doll. Her thick, snowy hair cascaded down her back in unruly waves, emphasizing the elongated shape of her visage. There was an odd scent about her, and her plain red dress bore specks of dirt. What a sweet little girl, she hissed, inhaling deeply as if craving more than just the chilly morning air. I could only stare at her with wide-eyed fear, feeling my father's hand on my shoulder and catching his subtle, disapproving glance. Good morning, Mrs. Gloff, I replied, my voice quivering. You creepy old witch. What a sweetheart. She playfully tapped the tip of my nose, her bushy eyebrows furrowing slightly as she squinted at me. We locked eyes in silence for a few uncomfortable seconds. I can't thank you enough for this, Annie, my father interjected, clearing his throat. Oh, sure, yes, no problem at all. Glad to help, ho-ho. She waved her gaunt hand dismissively and straightened up, beaming broadly. Her oversized, fish-like eyes remained fixated on me. Something about her didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Her smile was unnaturally wide, too wide, stretching from ear to ear, revealing tiny yellow teeth. I had never seen anyone smile so broadly in my life. Would you like to join us for breakfast, David? We were just about to eat, she offered without averting her gaze from me. Oh, thank you for the offer, my father chuckled nervously, but I'm in a hurry. My plane leaves in 2 hours. I sensed that he too was feeling the unease brought on by those probing eyes. That's a shame, she replied. You do look a bit underfed, David. Perhaps you could use a bit more food. She softly caressed his arm, emitting a hoarse, high-pitched laugh that sent shivers down my spine. My sister always tells me that, my father said, his complexion growing even paler. All right, I should get going so you can enjoy your breakfast in peace. Please watch over Natalie for me. She's a well-behaved kid, right, sweetheart? He squeezed my shoulder. I nodded and gulped simultaneously as she peered down at me, still wearing that eerie smile. Her large red eyes sparkled wildly. Oh, yes. We'll behave while your dear father is away, won't we, sweetie? She hissed, a warning I couldn't ignore. She reached out her long, bony hand toward me, and I instinctively recoiled. You smell so sweet, don't you? After my father's departure, she guided me through a dimly lit, elongated corridor, leading to an oval-shaped room that appeared worn and unkempt. As I followed closely behind her, dust particles floated through the air. At the hallway's end stood an ancient-looking statue of the Virgin Mary, sending shivers down my spine as I passed by. Along the walls, black and white photos were displayed in dusty old fedoras. It struck me that this house could use a touch of color. All the curtains were tightly drawn, allowing only a sliver of light to seep into the dining room, casting an eerie reddish glow. In the center of the room sat a small round dining table, meticulously arranged with empty plates and a large bowl of the most unappetizing soup I had ever laid eyes on. She pulled out a creaky wooden chair and motioned for me to do the same. "Come," she said, "we're having breakfast." Mrs. Glock, I've already had breakfast this morning," I responded, attempting to sound cheerful and polite. I eyed the greasy, dark liquid in the bowl with caution. The thought of spending a week in this place did nothing to stimulate my appetite. She pursed her lips, shaking her head in disagreement while closely examining my face. "Oh, I'm afraid you must do as I say, my dear. It's the rules." Her condescending tone left me feeling both insulted and queasy. "The rules?" I stammered. "Yes, you must adhere to all the rules while you're in my home," she continued, pushing a cup of tea toward me. Her words descended upon me like a chilling downpour as I gazed up at her. "Breakfast, lunch, and dinner are served punctually. No going out after dark. Never open doors and windows without permission. Ensure all lights are turned off by 9, and always obey my instructions." "But—" I swallowed hard, unable to tear my gaze away from the unappetizing soup before me. "Oh, and one more thing." She turned in her chair, directing her gaze past me toward another long, dim, narrow hallway adjacent to the stairs. "Stay out of the basement. Mrs. Glock, the rules, child. The rules must be followed," she declared firmly, clicking her tongue in irritation. I took a step back from the table. Despite the ever-present smile on her face, I sensed her impatience bubbling beneath the surface of every word she spoke. I don't think I'm not hungry yet, She slammed her hand down forcefully on the table, causing a loud thud that reverberated throughout the room, making me gasp in horror. She continued to smile, but her eyes gleamed with anger. It was becoming evident that I was walking on thin ice with this woman. "Forgive me, but I believe I'm the one in charge here." "And didn't your feeble father mention that if you misbehave, I'm allowed to discipline you?" she growled. "Discipline me?" I stammered, my stomach tying itself into knots. I had conversed with him over the phone before he dropped you off. I yearned to escape as far as possible, yet the reality of my situation held me captive. I was now tethered to her, and any inkling of comfort I had harbored before my father's departure had swiftly dissipated. "Quit acting like a brat. Settle into that chair and savor your breakfast." Her demeanor transformed, displaying a subtle delight in my discomfort. I nodded solemnly, tears welling up in my eyes. Silently, I placed my backpack on the floor beside me and seated myself. "Very well." She presented a plate heaped with what appeared to be charred, greasy slices of meat drenched in a verdant sauce. I stared at it in horror, my stomach churning. What in the world could this repulsive meal be made of? A deceased raccoon, perhaps? "We need to plump you up while you're here," she remarked, then settled into the chair opposite me. "No one leaves this house resembling a skeletal rat. I won't allow it." Once more I nodded. "Bon appetit," she cheered, beaming down at me with her bloodshot eyes. I began to voice my objections, but it felt as though something lodged in my throat. I took a deep breath and suppressed the urge to provoke her further. "So, how old are you?" she inquired, greedily gnawing at her meal like a stray dog. I began, holding my breath as I reluctantly took a bite of the meat, chewing and swallowing. She cleared her throat and I looked up at her. "Yes," she prompted, waiting patiently. I remained silent for a moment, gazing at her while savoring the rich flavors of the meat dancing on my tongue. "Oh," I eventually uttered, still reveling in the sweet and slightly tangy aftertaste. Without hesitation, I took another bite, savoring the savory juices that burst in my mouth, streaming down my chin. I paid no mind to the mess. It was too delectable, too flawless. "Seems like someone's enjoying their meal," she sneered. "Oh, I mumbled through a mouthful, struggling to take another bite. "Take it easy, kid. We don't want you choking," she cautioned, setting down her knife and fork and taking a sip of tea, her plate already empty. "I've never," I began, alternating between bites, "had anything this exquisite in my life. My father is an exceptional cook." "Ho ho, now you're making me blush," she waved a hand, a pleased expression on her face. I used to work at a restaurant in Paris in my 30s. I was quite skilled. You are skilled. I nodded enthusiastically, greedily popping another bite into my mouth as if deprived of such indulgent meals for decades. I'm delighted you enjoy my cooking. Enjoy it? I adore it, I exclaimed loudly. May I, have some more? I stared longingly at the still steaming pot in front of me. Please help yourself. Without hesitation, I reached for more, and within moments I found myself moaning in ecstasy, savoring the sweet, melt-in-your-mouth tenderness of the meat on my tongue. Seriously. I struggled to speak through a bite of food, then took a sip of tea to wash it down. This is the best meal I've ever had in my entire life. My dear, you have no idea of the great lengths I went to for this, she chuckled. For years, many have come to my doorstep, asking for the recipe, begging, even offering a lot of money to learn it. But I never gave in. The things you desire are not always the things you deserve. So it's a secret? I inquired, feeling a bit upset that she had kept the recipe to herself all this time. Well, it will be a secret no more, she whispered with a perfunctory nod. Suddenly my eyes grew heavy and my mind became drowsy. Silence enveloped the entire room. It was tranquil and peaceful for a while. Then, like a gust of cold wind, her voice returned. Strange words flowed from her mouth, undulating like waves, wrapping around me from every direction. I squinted my eyes. I had never heard something so beautiful. Sorry, What were you? She grinned. I was asking you about Peter Corns. Who? I furrowed my brow. She blinked. The boy who went missing. Oh, I sighed and glanced at my watch. Peter. Yes, she replied, suddenly looking interested. Have they found any clues about that poor boy's whereabouts? No, I don't think so. I shook my head. They searched the entire forest and hill behind the school last week and found nothing. I overheard our math teacher telling the police that maybe the boy had run away. But everyone else thinks he's been kidnapped. I see, she mumbled, more to herself. Do you know them? I asked her. Who? Peter and his parents. Oh no, I can't say I know his parents well. Do you know Peter then? I think I knew him rather well, she said, her voice filled with excitement. Quite well, actually, inside out. I looked up from my plate and stared at her. What do you mean you knew him? He's such a sweet boy, isn't he? She squinted down at me, smacking her lips loudly and grinning widely. Well, I didn't know him, V. It took a moment for her words to sink in, but as I grappled with the shock from the horrifying revelation, my spoon and knife slipped from my hands as a numbing wave of nausea washed over me. Her entire body began to shake and convulse violently as she leaned back into her chair, her mouth gaping wide as if preparing to scream, both eyes bulging as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. Locks of her snowy hair bounced against her shivering pale face as she emitted a sickening retching noise. Then a slimy mass that initially resembled a ping-pong ball was ejected from her mouth. It landed on the table with a dull thud right in front of me. It was then that I realized it was a small human eyeball. I began to retch as darkness closed in on my vision, desperately clinging to my chair, but my body couldn't bear the strain. Eventually, I succumbed to the overwhelming force of gravity, collapsing onto the floor and vomiting uncontrollably. A mixture of terror and disgust overwhelmed me. She contorted her body and opened her mouth again, ready to eject more of her doomed meal. I sprang to my feet and dashed towards the front door, stumbling through the dimly lit corridor, screaming at the top of my lungs, my stomach still in agony from expelling the wretched contents. Her demonic retching and gurgling grew louder behind me, but I dared not look back. I flung the door wide open and bolted into the street, not caring where I was headed, only desperate to put as much distance as possible between us. The brilliantly illuminated world outside felt like a revelation, as if I had been trapped in darkness for an eternity. I kept running until my legs ached and my chest burned from exhaustion. Eventually, I collapsed on the sidewalk, her horrifying sounds still ringing in my ears. When I regained my senses, I found myself surrounded by unfamiliar faces peering down at me with concern. Amidst my hysterical sobs, I recounted the harrowing ordeal. When the police searched the house, they discovered her lifeless body in the dining room, just as I had left her. Her cause of death remained undetermined, but the local newspapers later revealed that she had passed away from a heart attack at the age of 88. Then came the grisly revelation. In her basement, they found Peter Corns, or what remained of him. She had abducted the poor boy, chaining him to the wall for weeks, subjecting him to relentless torture and slow dismemberment, keeping him barely alive long enough for his wounds to heal before ending his suffering. It was a nightmarish way to die, and his parents were devastated beyond measure. The sound of a knock on my front door snapped my wandering thoughts back to the present. "Mom, are you still there? Hello? Oh God, not again. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm here. I have to go now. Wait, what? Is everything okay? Yes, everything's fine. Someone's at the front door. I'll talk to you later, okay?" I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket as I hurried across the kitchen and into the living room. "Good morning." James Ham greeted me with a broad smile as I swung the door open, accompanied by a plump boy with freckles and a pale face. "Good morning," I smiled down at them both. "This is Maddie," he said, affectionately ruffling the boy's thick, curly red hair. "Well, Maddie, aren't you going to say hello to our neighbor too?" "Good morning." The boy waved his hands and giggled happily. "Well now," I bent down and playfully tapped the tip of his nose as the familiar sensation returned, my voice tingling with excitement. "Aren't you just the sweetest little thing ever?"